Okay, Eurasian Q and American Q at the bottom, where the native Indians are from.
The American side of this family tree, so what I've just done here is I've isolated out this branch and I've rotated it 90 degrees, so now time moves from left to right instead of top to bottom. If you zoom in, you can probably read some of these names. Pima Indians, Mayans, Caritianas, and Suris from Brazil. Those are some of the populations that were sampled for this particular study. And you can see this whole section right here of Native Americans breaks away, separates from Mongolian. Pathran and Makrani are Pakistani groups. Russian, Naxi and Han are in China. Hazara in Afghanistan. These are Eurasian peoples. So the Eurasian section of Q separates from the American section of Q, which implies a migration event, around the 300s to 600s AD. That's when, to make a long story short, one of the populations in the Americas arrived, 300s to 600s AD. There's really interesting history here, why it happened. It correlates to the time of major movements in Central Asia, when the Huns came into Europe and overthrew the Roman Empire, when the Shanbai were overthrowing and infiltrating China at the fall of the Han Dynasty, and so on. But this is all stuff I've covered elsewhere and don't have time to review. Instead, I want to draw your attention to another section of the tree in the Americas that will be especially important here in a few minutes once we bridge the gap. It's this other branch known as C. This is also found in Central Asia, among other places. You can find it in the Pacific as well. In past videos and in writing, I've talked about this branch arriving in the Americas a little bit later, around 1000 AD. That was a rough estimate based on the data that was available at that time. I can tell you now that we have more data, that we can probably revise that and make it more precise to about the 900s AD. That's still several centuries after haplogroup Q. And if we back up a second, I can cover something I forgot to mention just a few minutes ago. The size of these circles represents the relative abundance. So you can see these circles right here are not quite as large as the circles for this branch. Haplogroup is just the term for branch, Q. So about 90% of Navajos, this circle right here, belong to haplogroup Q, whereas just a fraction of them, you can see it's a tiny circle right here, belong to this haplogroup or branch C. And again, we can revise this now to the 900s. This is all information I've put in print in this book, Traced, came out in March of 2022, Traced Human DNA's Big Surprise, and I've talked about it in previous video series, which I'll point you to those links in a moment. So just to summarize then, I covered a lot of ground fairly quickly, again, because this has been covered elsewhere, and this sets up how we're going to begin to bridge this gap. What this Y chromosome research implies is multiple settlings of the Americas. You'll notice I didn't talk about BC era branches. Who gave rise to the Mayans, to the Olmecs? That's because we don't have those branches yet. That's something we're still looking for. Again, we have the potential to identify movements, rises and falls in population sizes, migrations. So I talked about major migrations from one continent to another. If you're thinking about this and drawing this logic out, in theory, we should be able to identify movements within a continent. Movements of the Lakotas from Minnesota, or perhaps from the Ohio River Valley, and so on. This has the potential to begin to close the gap between archaeology, pre-Columbian archaeology, and post-contact geography and nations. Now, at that time, March 2022, I did not have sufficient data to identify specific branches of the tree or sub-branches of the tree with specific nations. But that's where we were.
This is the all-new Doritos Cool Ranch Papadilla from Papa John's. Bold Doritos Cool Ranch flavor with our signature flatbread style sandwich for the zestiest flavor mashup ever. Only at Papa John's. Joe and Francine.
One other line of evidence that we were exploring and that I published on and talked about a year ago was the indigenous history of at least one of these nations, the Delaware. This map shows you the Algic language family. The Delaware nation, the Delaware language belongs to the Algic language family, and this map will become more relevant here in a moment. But for our purposes right year ago was the following. The Red Record, or the Wallam Olam, was recognized as the Delaware Nation's indigenous history for many years due to a thesis that was written about 1995 claiming that this record was a forgery. The Delaware Nation has now disowned it. I have showed in times past that there was a tremendous amount of history recorded in this record that matches exactly what we see in the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA tree. Long story short, I find it difficult to believe that this so-called forgery could have anticipated genetic discoveries 150 years later. So, to give you the backstory, this was recognized, or collected, I should say, by Europeans in the early 1800s. It's since been claimed that this guy from Kentucky, who collected the record, actually forged it and made it up. It wasn't actually the Delaware Nation's history. So this is early 1800s, and I'm telling you, and I've said in print and in videos before, that this history and this record matches point for point the history that we see in the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA-based family tree. So how could some guy in the early 1800s have invented out of whole cloth in indigenous history, in Indian history, that just so happened to match genetic discoveries a century and a half, 2 centuries later? I don't think that's just an accident. I think what the real story is, this is a real record from the Delaware Nation, from the Lenape, that tells their history. And just to summarize, again, because I've gone in more detail elsewhere, but just for our purposes, give you a brief taste of it. This record describes something that sounds like a creation event that matches Genesis 1. At the beginning, the sea was everywhere, covered the earth. Sounds like Genesis 1:2. The Great Spirit moved, and so on, bringing forth the sky, the earth. Sounds like a creation event. There's also a flood that I'm omitting here that they describe. It sounds like a global flood with some survivors. They seem to describe an ice age after the flood. Their home was icy, their home was snowy, talking about the Lenape in the old land, the winter land. They describe then, after being in this icy land, what appears to be a crossing of probably the Bering Strait by the Dark Fish Sea. The Gaping Hollow Sea settled the White Eagle clan, the White Wolf clan. They crossed. Aquaman is, if you read on in the text, seems to describe the Americas. They describe how many people crossed, 10,000, or 10 times 1,000 they crossed, so 10,000 people. They arrive, and this is where it gets very detailed. Once they arrive in North America, they describe a series of about 95, 96 sachems. Here they say White Eagle had been the path maker. Let me advance a slide here. The next sachem, and that's the main term that's used over and over again. The next sachem was History Man, written records he began. Next sachem was Shrivel Man, next sachem was Drought. This is the pattern you see going forward in the narrative. The name of the guy and 1 or 2 significant things that happened while he was sachem. So you'll notice early in the record, the Red Record itself claims that they began to write this history. Wisecraftian Council, just some more snippets. I want to draw something out here. This will get us now closer to closing the gap between post-contact and pre-contact. It's not just the Lenape's history. It is their history that they wrote down, but it doesn't just talk about them alone. They talk about neighbors and enemies. He could fight every foe. The strong stone he struck down. Wholehearted was the sachem fighting the snakes. Now at first pass, this may just sound like figurative language. You look in context, it's clearly talking about specific types of peoples. Where this gets even more interesting is when you begin to look at the names and the origin of the names of some of these nations that we all take for granted. When I say the term Sioux, many Caucasians will say, yeah, I know who you're talking about. Well, what does the word Sioux mean? The word Sioux means adder or snake in the Ojibwe language. Why would the Ojibways be giving them a name? Because they were neighbors. Remember what I just told you about the Lakotas? The Ojibways were pushing on the Dakotas, the Santee Sioux, who then pushed on the Lakotas, and they went out to the plains. The Ojibways are right here. If we superimpose these 2 language maps in the grayish now color, you can see the Sioux and Catawban language family. Here's the Ojibways, they're neighbors. Assiniboines, right here, means one who roasts using stones. there's a group of Siouan speakers called the Stonies. Hopefully this now begins to connect a few dots. When this account talks about the strong stone, the snakes, this isn't figurative language. These are the names they've applied to their neighbors. So yes, this is the red record, the Lenni Lenape's record of their history, but you're going to get some clues to other nations as you read it. This has much larger implications than just one nation. As you get further along in the narrative, they eventually reach the Atlantic Ocean, the Sun Salt Sea, they say. They talk about who was the sachem then. They talk about the arrival of the whites twice. There's an initial sighting of them, for at this time, from the Dawn Sea, the whites appeared. And then the red record ends with this sachem watching closely, was the sachem looking seaward, for at that time, from north and south, the white people came, friendly people in great ships. Who are they? And this is likely the Dutch in 1620, and this is how the red record ends. This has been speculated to be the arrival in 1524 Verrazzano. I think he was an Italian conquistador. Long story short, if you walk through all the details of the red record, and again, I don't have time to walk you through verse by verse what it says, you can map out where the Lenni Lenape, the Delaware, came from, where they went, where they crossed the Mississippi River, where they eventually landed when the Dutch arrived and Europeans arrived in the 1600s. 96 sachems traces this migration path. Again, we can put a date right there. There's two other dates we can estimate. In fact, there's two dates, leads to an ambiguity that I'm going to get to here in a moment. 1396 is a date that's been given for the arrival of the Lenape at the Atlantic Ocean based on wampum records. This is like a secondary, tertiary source of it. Someone said they talked to so-and-so, and then he communicated to so-and-so, and that's how I found out about it. Written records from the colonial era. I'm actually suspicious that I might be talking about the Ojibways. They might have been the nations confused. But anyway, you have this date. And then you have the date of the first sighting of the whites, which I think is Verrazzano 1524. Anyway, the point being, you have a date for the arrival of the Sun Salt Sea, you know, the sachem. You've got the closing of the red record, 1620. You've got these two dates, the number of years that have passed, plus you can count the number of sachems between these two dates, which gives you an estimate of the average sachem rule length. And you can extrapolate backwards in time and say, okay, when did they arrive in the Americas? You use the wampum-based date, you get the 200s AD for the arrival. If you use the Verrazzano, so again, so-and-so was the sachem from the Dawn Sea, the whites first appeared, you put 1524 as a date then. You can do the subtraction here to find how many years have transpired. You know how many sachems then from the red record exist between these two dates. Then you get an estimate for how long each sachem rules. Then you extrapolate backwards in time. It gives you a very different number, about the 900s AD. Now, both of these numbers are compatible with the genetic history. But my point is, there's an ambiguity of several centuries. So if you try to assign dates to this intervening period, what do? If you want to, so these are going to be pre-Columbian dates. If you want to assign locations and dates to try to connect the red record to archaeology, you've got this several century ambiguity, and now you're stuck. Now, I said I've talked about this elsewhere. We did a 25-part video series in 2020, The New History of the Human Race. If you go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, so YouTube channel, Answers in Genesis, find this playlist. Episode 13 goes into much more detail on this red record. I've also got technical papers on this. In 2020, I published the first announcement of an agreement between the red record and the genetic data. And of course, I go into even more detail in this book, Traced Human DNA's Big Surprise. So let me stop and summarize. What I've told you so far is all attempts prior to today, prior to April of 2022, to bridge the gap between pre-Columbian archaeology and post-Columbian nations. I haven't yet. And we haven't by March 2022, but we've made good progress in setting up a new framework. I have good genetic data to show all sorts of dynamic movement from Eurasia into the Americas, a very dynamic history in the pre-Columbian world, radically new information that no one had been talking about before. But I haven't yet been able to identify specific branches of the Y chromosome family tree with specific nations. And on the indigenous history side of things, again, I haven't had time to justify this in this time with you, but I have talked about it again in those other videos and print resources, how this red record record implies there have been multiple settlings of the Americas. The red record talks about there being people in the Americas before the Lenape arrived. It talks about their movements. You can map it out. But this chronological ambiguity, did they arrive in the 200s AD or the 900s AD, made it difficult to press the record for more detail beyond what we were able to infer. It made it difficult to close the gap. So that was the second point. We've begun, up to March 2022, we began to close the gap between the archaeological record and the post-Columbian history with these revolutionary discoveries, returning to the Delaware Nation the history that was taken away from them. It was told to them that this was a forgery. I think we have good evidence that it was not, but was actual indigenous history that was collected by a guy in Kentucky and has been transmitted to us fairly faithfully, and just so happens to match very closely the history that we see in the Y chromosome record. So this sets us up now to where we were a year ago. This raises the questions. Can we press this data further? Can we dig further into the Y chromosome tree and the native histories to connect them to one another and to the archaeological record? Can we close this gap? So what I'm going to show you now, what I'm going to claim, and you can watch and decide if I've justified this claim. What I'm going to claim now is that we've successfully begun to bridge one of the biggest gaps in the history of North America, and in a revolutionary and a spectacular way. This is the beginning of the lost history of North America. What transpired that then disappeared and that we're now beginning to recover. And here's how I'm going to do it. Right now, I haven't been able to connect Y chromosome branches to specific nations or to their indigenous histories. But I'm going to. And the way I'm going to do it is via an indirect route. I'm going to connect Y chromosome branches to a particular language family. So now I am going to be able to connect a specific sub-branch to a specific nation or group of nations related by language. And then we're going to connect the native history to that same language family. And so the Y chromosome history is going to, via this path, be able to inform and help anchor native history. And that anchored native history is going to blow open this question of archaeology. This is where I'm going. These are the steps I'm about to take. So let's now do it together. I said about a year ago, we had insufficient data to identify specific sub-branches of the Y chromosome family tree with specific tribes. Since that time, one of the biggest genetic testing companies in the world, Family Tree DNA, has released their Y chromosome DNA-based family tree. And they say they have 214,000 tested users. So what happens if you work with this company, if you take one of their tests, is you pay the fee, you have the option of giving your background, your known paternal history, they send you a test kit, they take like a saliva sample or a cheek sample, you send back, they test it, and then they give you results. And I think you can agree or not agree to be part of their publicly available Y chromosome tree. The data has some limitations. Unlike some of the academic data, they don't tell you which nation, in terms of Native American nation you come from or First Nation you come from. It's based on current political entities. So for North America, or you can report, yes, I'm from the United States, yes, I'm from Canada. So when I say North America, I'm referring heavily now to north of the Rio Grande, because south of that, Mexico and such, is Mesoamerica, and that's a whole other topic for the day. North of the Rio Grande, North America, you can say I'm from Canada, I'm from the United States, or they also have the option of saying I'm from the United States and I have Native American ancestry. Or you can say I'm from Canada and I have First Nation ancestry, paternal ancestry. So there's really four options. And what I want to focus on then is these two branches that we've already talked about, haplogroup or branch C, haplogroup or branch Q. We already know from the academic literature these are the major Native American branches. So we can specifically look at the family tree DNA database. We can look at the haplogroup C branch in that database. We can look at the Q branch in that database and count the number of individuals in the United States and Canada, or I should say United States Native Americans or Canadian First Nations or frankly, any from these two countries in these branches because we know they're native, and we know the specific sub-branches that are native. Fine. How is that helpful to our purposes? There's another set of data that's going to blow this wide open. We also have publicly available census data. So when the U.S. does a census, and I'm using the 2010 numbers, that's what I had access to, the U.S. asks questions about Native history. Are you Native? And are you only Native? So there's about 4 different categories you can answer. You can say, yes, I'm Native, and I'm only Native. Well, let me break it down this way. You can say, I'm Native and only Native, or I'm Native plus German, Italian, something like that. If you say you're only Native, they're going to ask you, well, are you belonging to a single nation, or does your ancestry include multiple nations? If you say I'm Native plus, well, is your native side only Native, or is it multiple nations? Or one nation or multiple nations? That's how the data is broke down. The Canadian census data, which I have access to from 2016, doesn't break it down quite as detailed. You can say, are you from First Nation or not? And are you mixed or not? And each of these data sets, what I looked at carefully was the category that was the most restrictive. So for the U.S. Census data, I said, let me focus on the numbers of those people who said, I'm Native and only one nation. I'm Navajo and only Navajo. I'm Cherokee and only Cherokee. This is how the numbers break down. And this is looking at percentages in terms of the total category in that column. So Native, only one nation. How do those numbers break down? And I've broken it down by language family. Ayak Athabascan, which would include Navajo, Apache, and such. Iroquoian, which would include Cherokee. Algic, which would include Chippewa, Delaware, and such. Muskogean, which would include the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and such. Sioux and Catawba, which we talked about earlier. Udo Aztecan, which includes some of the Pueblo peoples, the Hopis, and Eskimo Aleut. And you can see here, the bigger point I'm trying to communicate with this graph is that within the United States, there's a fairly diverse distribution of living Native Americans who say, I'm Native and only one nation. It's distributed among several different language families. That's perhaps not a category in which you're used to thinking, or that I'm used to thinking, but I'm reporting it this way because if you look at the Canadian data, it's not this well distributed at all. It is heavily skewed towards a single language family, the Algic language family, which would include Ojibwa, Cree, and so on. The Eskimo Aleut is the next category, Iroquoian, and such. But you can see here 80% belong to Algic, whereas there's nothing that comes anywhere close to that percentage in the United States data. So let me simplify this. I've been talking about the Delaware or Lenni Lenape Red Record, Wallamolo. They belong to the Algic language family. And if we break down these categories into Algic or some other group, this is how the US versus Canada data break down. In Canada, almost 80% are Algic language family. This is living natives. In the United States, the numbers are almost the reverse. Only 15% would say we're part of the Algic language family, and 85% of the US Native Americans belong to something else, some other group. Okay. I mentioned the family tree DNA data set. I'm now going to bring those results in and compare it to the census data because I think we can use these data to connect a branch to a nation or group of nations. So what does the family tree DNA data set say about haplogroups or branches C and Q? How does it break down in terms of Canada versus the United States? Did you know that of those haplogroup C and Q individuals in the family tree DNA data set that are Canadian, 94% belong to haplogroup Q? That's a crazy amount of skewing. But it's intriguing because it seems to roughly correlate with the census data. The vast majority of Canadian First Nation individuals are Algic language family members. The vast majority genetically of Canadian natives are haplogroup C. This data alone would be strong evidence to say branch C represents the Algic language family. And this would be the first time I've been able to connect a specific branch with a specific nation or group of nations. But it gets better. What if we bring in the US data? Once again, the data match quite intriguingly. Again, the Algic language family members in the United States, living natives, only 15% of the total. And appropriately, if haplogroup C is Algic, a small minority of the US haplogroup C and Q individuals are in C. There's almost this mirror image as it should be. So together, these results are strong evidence, if you've not followed anything I've said so far, this is the main conclusion. First time I've been able to connect a sub-branch of the family tree to a specific nation or group of nations. Haplogroup C is a very strong candidate for being the branch of the Algic language family. You want to know the Algic, you want to know Delaware history? Look at haplogroup C. Okay. How does this bridge the gap between pre-Columbian archaeology and post-Columbian nations? Well, it's step one. I've been able to connect a specific branch to a specific language family. Haplogroup C to the Algic language family. Still work with me here, because now we're going to connect this to native history. I said the problem with connecting this native history, the Delaware nation's history, is this chronological ambiguity. There's a couple different dates late in the record, and if you extrapolate back in time, you get a several century difference. Well, one of those dates is the 900s. It's one of the possibilities. Again, this is the Delawares are part of this larger Algic language family, goes without saying. So we've got a native history that belongs to the Algic language family, on one hand. I've got Y chromosome branches, a specific sub-branch that I can connect to the Algic language family. That was this data right here. And if you'll think back a few minutes ago to what I told you, what we already knew, going back to March 2022, about haplogroup C, this arrives in the Americas about the 900s AD. So I think we have good scientific justification for using the chronology based on DNA, which we can connect to here, which connects to here. We can use this chronology to help resolve the ambiguity in the native history. This data right here. So we can, instead of displaying it this way with, well, it could be the 200s, it could be the 900s, I think we have good scientific evidence to say the Delaware Red Record begins in the 900s AD, and now you can change these question marks to hard dates. We're still not good at archaeology, but I said, if we can do this, now we can begin to connect native histories to the archaeological record. Can we? I've claimed that. Can we? I'm going to draw your attention to one specific set of events in this Red Record history. Around the Mississippi River, in what's now dated to the mid to late 1200s AD, a century or two before Columbus. Here's the relevant section of the Lenni Lenapes Red Record. I'm going to read it to you, and I'm going to focus on the details here because this is where it gets explosive. East looking was the sachem, melancholy about the war there was, and I'm setting it up here for you. To the rising sun you now must go, he said, many were those who eastward went. So they're before the Mississippi, they're somewhere out west, and they're saying you gotta go east. They separated at the Mississippi. The lazy ones remained behind. So, by the way, this Red Record itself talks about migration events. So you think about the larger, not just the Siouan neighbors, but the other members of the Algic language family. This Red Record is probably clues to this as well. When did the Cree originate, the part of the Algic language family? It's probably one of the separation events recorded in this document. So I can put a date now on that. Around 1243 AD is when they separated the Mississippi. I can put dates when there's a sachem. The lodge man was the sachem. The Talega possessed the east. We can put a date on that. 1251, roughly. Strong ally was the sachem. Land to the east he asked for, 1258. For that, eastward some traveled, Talega king massacred them. Now, I've just read two names that might be unfamiliar to you. The Talegas, who are they? The Red Record doesn't necessarily tell us, but it gives us some clues. It says they possessed the East. So just to stop and summarize for a moment before we go to the archaeological record, what the Red Record says, this anchored narrative, puts them at the Mississippi by about AD 1250, and in confrontation with the Talegas, whoever they are, they're possessing the East, so they're a powerful group of people. Now you might recall from the beginning of this time together that I mentioned from the archaeological record the city of Cahokia, greatest city north of the Rio Grande before the arrival of Europeans. And I say that because I'll just quote the textbook for you now. This ancient North America, Brian Fagan. Fagan was a professor at UC Santa Barbara, archaeological record of North America. He says Cahokia flourished with what was probably the highest population density north of Mexico. So that's his statement. Interesting. Cahokia is now modern St. Louis. So the anchor Delaware narrative puts them at the Mississippi by AD 1250. Not necessarily St. Louis, but it's a powerful enemy ruling the East. And if you're looking at the archaeological record for candidates of powerful enemies ruling the East, Cahokia kind of comes to mind. Is that a fair equivalence to say the Delawares are confronting the rulers of Cahokia? We'll read on what the archaeological record says, again quoting from this book, textbook. Sedentary villages prospered at or near Cahokia after AD 600. Not a big town, not a big city at that point. Then apparently within a few decades, around AD 1050, a great center emerged at Cahokia itself. The height of its power was between 1050 and 1250. Cahokia's power declined after AD 1250 when other large centers rose to prominence. Moundville by the Black Warrior River in west central Alabama flourished between AD 1250 and circa 1500. Moundville, here's an image of it in Alabama. You can see it's not nearly as imposing or as large as some of the mounds in Cahokia. And just so that we're all on the same page in terms of geography, what this archaeological record implies is that Cahokia was this great city until about 1250, and then it declines. But around the same time that it declines, other sets of mound-building cultures arise to the southeast. So I said the Red Record talks about the Delawares arriving in the Mississippi confronting some powerful